lowly tarnished, I have a question for you. What is your favorite part of Elden Ring? Many of you will say it's open world, so full of delightful discoveries. Others will say it's challenging but fair combat that we all dearly love and enjoy. And the history nerds among you will say it's brilliantly written lore. But through all the praise and accolades, there is an aspect of Elden Ring that seems to be neglected in these conversations. I've been binging a lot of Slavic media lately. I guess binging isn't the right word, as that implies I have some sort of autonomy and intention in my viewing habits. More accurately, I've been drawn to the corpse of Chernobyl. I've always had a fascination with Chernobyl when I first learned about it about a decade ago. But it wasn't until I started watching HBO's Chernobyl that I was led down a rabbit hole of its history and eventually its aftermath. I discovered a community of people who illegally trespass into the exclusion zone, driven by various motivations, but united by a shared fascination with the decaying remains of Pripyat and Chernobyl. These individuals are known as stalkers. I learned I wasn't alone in this obsession of mine. Learning about the stalkers then led me to watch Stalker. Despite its name, don't be fooled into thinking this movie is inspired by the real-life stalkers of Chernobyl. It predates the disaster itself, released in 1979, long before the nuclear plant was even constructed. Yet among its many themes, it manages to unintentionally foreshadow the horrors that would befall the world a mere 7 years later. Almost as if Tarkovsky's vision reached beyond fiction into some type of grim prophecy. I then discovered that some mad geniuses at GSC Game World drank just enough vodka to put 2 and 2 together, weaving the surreal, philosophical essence of Tarkovsky's Stalker with the very real and harrowing tragedy of Chernobyl. The result was, Stalker. Wait, again? No, sorry. Stalker, an acronym this time. Shadow of Chernobyl. An entirely new beast born from 2 eerily connected historical and fictional parallel events. When I wasn't busy dumping about 6 shells into the back of an Adidas-clad bandit, point blank range, and still managing to die, I was fascinated by how Shadow of Chernobyl turns the zone into a decaying, sentient presence, pulsing with a malevolent indifference to the human lives that trespass within its maw. Anomalies, radiation, and emissions weave the zone into an environment that actively resists human intrusion, indifferent to survival or understanding. Its landscapes embody decay as a living force, making the zone feel less like a setting and more like a writhing corpse vomiting all these anomalies and monstrosities into the world. Yet for all its death and decay, there is an undeniable beauty to the zone, one that feels paradoxical and haunting. Sunlight filters through cracked clouds, casting long shadows across desolate fields. Anomalies shimmer like water, their lethality cloaked in this bizarre beauty. It's a place where beauty and decay are not opposites, but intertwined in a dance macabre that speaks to the heart of Gothic horror. The zone isn't just a setting, it's a character. It bears the weight of history, tragedy, and human hubris, and in doing so, it confronts the fragility of our own human nature. This is a place where every ruin, every anomaly, and every tragedy shows that the past does not stay buried. It festers, it persists, and it shapes the world in its image. So, what the hell does any of this have to do with Elden Ring, I hear you impatiently asking. Imagine stepping into a world where beauty and decay are inseparable, where every crumbling tower and twisted creature feels like a monument to something ancient, tragic, and deeply sour. A world that is effectively a corpse. That is Elden Ring to me. This is a world where beauty and rot dance together in the ruins of civilizations long past. Despite being a game with much deserved acclaim, Elden Ring still manages to harbor criminally underrated aspects in its sprawling, tortured world. While most people focus on the epic boss fights, intricate lore, and meticulous world building of this game, I want to take yet another opportunity to appreciate the darker side of this masterpiece. And by darker, I am referring to the heavy influence of Gothic horror on Elden Ring. From the corruption of Godwyn and the disease-like spread of Deathroot to the tragic necromantic undertones of Thea, Elden Ring embodies Gothic horror in its very foundations. Its world brims with stark contrast, serene beauty descending into madness, grotesque truths hidden away in the darkest depths of its roots. There's Gothic horror in this game you probably didn't even realize was Gothic horror. Just because a character doesn't look like some tourist goth e-girl doesn't mean it ain't goth. They just don't make goths the same anymore, do they? Gothic horror is far more than an aesthetic. It is a place where light and shadow clash. Tragic fates are, basically guaranteed, and every step deeper into the lands between reveals that darkness is not just a product of this strange world, it's in the heart of those who dwell in it. So join me as we explore the dark and Gothic roots of Elden Ring with your hosts, Ramm and the Lamb. Viewer discretion is advised. Alright, first things first. What exactly is Gothic horror? It's not just about spooky vibes, dramatic castles, and crippling isolated depression, although that's definitely a part of the deal. Gothic horror is a genre rooted in decay, both physical and emotional. It's about the beauty of the past, contrasted with the terror of what it's become. Think of abandoned cathedrals overtaken by darkness, cursed families doomed to repeat their mistakes, monsters that mix horror with tragedy, all that jazz. Gothic horror originated in the 18th century, emerging as a distinct genre that married elements of romanticism with the macabre and supernatural. It is often credited to the Castle of Otranto, which is widely considered the first Gothic novel. This work introduced key elements that would define Gothic horror. Think Scooby-Doo, basically. Ancient castles, supernatural horrors, dark secrets, and the exploration of human frailty in the face of overwhelming forces. The genre really hit its stride in the 19th century with the first, and quite frankly based, generation of goths such as Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, and Bram Stoker, who evolved the genre in a way that grappled with humanity's greatest fears: death, the inner self, and the unknown. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's gotta be one of my favorites. Mary Shelley added a layer of tragedy and moral complexity to its creature, which shifted Gothic horror beyond just a display of the dark and macabre and into an exploration of deeper, more existential themes embedded in these dark realities. In other words, the main reason why I, and many others, love the genre of horror. Like I said earlier, Gothic horror is more than just an aesthetic. It is also a genre that thrives on contrast, beauty and decay, grandeur and ruin, light and dark. It is the uneasy union of the sublime and the terrifying, where the awe of human achievements crumble under the weight of time, corruption, and despair. At its heart, Gothic horror is not just about scaring the audience. It's about unsettling them, forcing them to sit with the discomfort of inevitable decay and the fragility of everything they hold sacred. This sense of decay isn't just thematic, it's woven into the very fabric of the environments in these stories. The ghosts of the past. One of the defining traits of Gothic horror is its focus on setting. These stories are often grounded in places of grandeur that have fallen into ruin. These settings are not just set dressing, they are integral to the themes of Gothic horror. Let's take one of the earliest and most famous Gothic horror paintings as an example. Abbey Among Oak Trees by Caspar David Friedrich. The painting depicts the ruins of a medieval abbey framed by skeletal oak trees and a bleak, overcast sky. Much like the crumbling mansions and castles in Gothic literature, the abbey stands as a symbol of grandeur lost to time. Its ruined state evokes the guarantee of decay, a reminder of human impermanence in the face of nature's endurance. I'm a game designer at heart, although not in practice nowadays.
Curse you obtuse user interfaces!
So the way I like to describe this painting is by thinking, how would someone depict a corpse using only environmental design? The skeletal trees surrounding the abbey almost appear like bones stripped of their living flesh, like a rib cage popping out from an exposed belly. It creates a landscape that feels frozen in the state of death. The abbey's broken windows and roofless walls invite speculation about its past and how it ended up in this state. And really, I'm not sure how it ended up like this ultimately matters when, regardless of what happened, the abbey would sooner or later always reach this grim fate. Its former beauty corrupted into something grotesque, much like the OnlyFans succubus you gave all your life savings to. They will too eventually end up like this abbey, decayed and rotten. The corpse of this abbey is also the corpse of humanity at large, those opulent and grand in life, in the end, all returning to dust. When I first played Elden Ring, I was surprised by the feelings I experienced while exploring its vast world. Just from the title screen and intro cutscene, I anticipated FromSoft to take a more high fantasy adventure approach to this world. But stepping into the lands between, I was met with something far more somber. The ruins scattered across the landscape carry an overwhelming sense of melancholy. Everywhere you turn, remnants of lost civilizations lie buried, some sunken into the earth, others hidden deep underground, entombed by centuries of past time and erasure. These structures feel like gravestones to forgotten cultures. They are buried along with their traditions, their history, and even their names. I think it's striking how there seems to be so much history to these civilizations, yet little to no lore revealing some of their history. I mean, there's an entire YouTube channel dedicated to the archaeological study of these worlds. And what is archaeology if not the study of the dead? But even though this is not FromSoft's first depiction of a world that is functionally a corpse, it is, to my knowledge, the first time that some of these past civilizations in these worlds don't even have a known name. This seems uncharacteristic of FromSoft, given how detailed their lore is in their other games and even the rest of Elden Ring. While there has always been gaps and ambiguities in the lore, I don't remember an echo of silence this loud in any of their other games. These ruins don't just feel forgotten, they feel forsaken, buried deep within their tomb for all eternity. The Nox, creators of the Eternal Cities, a people and civilization who are currently in the process of being forgotten, quickly speeding towards the fate of other civilizations whose names have been erased by time, lured into their subterranean tomb, condemned to be buried and forgotten. When you first descend into the Eternal Cities, their beauty is undeniable, but that beauty is accompanied by a strong melancholy. One of my favorite moments in the game is when you first discover Nokron. This city is buried so deeply underground that the only way to access it is for a literal meteor to come crashing down on the land above it. Discovering the city for the first time felt surreal and almost alien. Unknown people, unknown beings, unknown culture, and your unknown self. And that feeling really comes to a head when you suddenly turn and see this. These giant corpses are just plain awesome. They're so visually striking that I had to pause for a second the first time I discovered one. The scale compared to the city makes you feel smaller and smaller the closer you get to the base of its decrepit throne. A detail I love is that all around these thrones are the petrified corpses of humanoid beings who were worshipping or praying to the being on the throne. The whole scene feels almost post-apocalyptic, their corpses serving as statues of a forgotten tragedy that occurred here, one that begs to be speculated on. Were they participants in a mass sacrificial event? Consumed by some doomed ritual to appease their gods or stave off annihilation? Did they sacrifice the giant being who now rots away? Or were they all subjected to some type of mass tragedy?
This is an automated reminder to wake up from the dull reality of your life and subscribe. Wake up.
The giant being on the throne is the only corpse in the area that isn't petrified and encased in stone. If you look at its hands, you can actually see rotting flesh still gripping on. This corpse has been slowly decaying for an undisclosed amount of time. It all paints a haunting picture. Now, there may very well be a detailed account and explanation of the events that occurred here from the great keeper of the lore. And if there is, feel free to share it in the comments. I, unfortunately, am allergic to such literate scholarly activities after a traumatic brain injury I sustained during my attempt to court Lanciax. No, I will not give further details on that incident. Yes, I've come to sorely regret my rash actions. And no, I will not give you Lanciax's number. I still got a chance. Go pester Gideon if you're so interested in my personal affairs.
I'm sorry for that Dragon Lanciax electrifying experience. Never thought you would date this dragon for real. It was just a joke, mate.
But anyways, my point is that the experience of coming across these pockets of environmental storytelling for the first time with little to no knowledge on the lore is the best part of the experience for me. You don't need a textbook to interpret what happened here. To me, these don't just feel like the corpses of a killed people that most video games just callously throw around. They feel like monuments to their tragedy, fossilized in eternal agony. I love how the petrified bodies are ingrained within the architecture itself, just like the decayed abbey among the oak trees. The city of Nokron is a corpse itself, although a bit more literally this time. These pillars and walls formed of intertwined corpses is a motif FromSoft loves to use, and this is one of my favorite examples. It reminds me a lot of Yarhar Ghul from Bloodborne after the moon ritual takes place, with all its inhabitants meeting an apocalyptic fate and forever encased within the walls of the city they died in. The deliberate lack of context when you first get here led me to a rabbit hole of speculation, and it's in this ambiguity that the Eternal Cities achieve their horror. They embody the Gothic theme of inevitable decay, a civilization undone by forces beyond their control or comprehension, whether their doom came from within as a result of hubris or from above as some sort of divine retribution. The Eternal Cities show the delicate dance between light and dark, beauty and ruin. A contrast the human race is very familiar with. Our homes are littered with the corpses of once beautiful architecture, now left to decay and only remembered through their history. Structures of immense technological sophistication, monuments to the aspirations of our technology, have met the same fate. And do not be fooled into thinking our modernity, with its advanced technology, modern knowledge, and advantage of hindsight, render us immune to this same fate. When the city I grew up in looked like the later half of Dark Souls 3, and residents could see the fucking dark sign from their backyard, we are clearly not immune. Whether from above or from within, ruin awaits all. Every society who met this fate felt modern in their respective space and time. We are not so different. Oh, and by the way, to bring it back to something a bit more lighthearted, like Elden Ring, do you remember how you traversed through many of these buried cities? A coffin. As if Miyazaki could not be more on the nose. You might have been just a little freaked out the first time you had to step into one of these coffins, unless you're a Souls vet where it's kind of a part of the program, but my brother in Christ, there's absolutely no reason to be afraid. You've been in a giant coffin this entire time. And some corpses in this giant coffin are still kicking. Godwyn the Golden, bringer of death and plague, king of the rats and crustaceans. The mere thought of such evil gives me conniptions. You may or may not remember Godwyn from the very beginning of the game, although maybe you were distracted by more provocative concerns. Godwyn was betrayed, murdered, and defiled by assassins sent by his half-sister. Which is already bad enough, but gets much worse when you stop and think about what dying must feel like for an immortal being. For his whole life, Godwyn believed he was immortal. His girl boss mommy, an avid genocide enjoyer, Queen Marika, had taken the very concept of death and hid it away well before he was even born. Godwyn was a child, born into a world without death. When you're immortal in the truest sense, what fear is there to have? what threats could truly concern him. It's not like they could kill him or anything, right? Oh, shit. The sheer terror he must have felt in these final moments is hard to grasp. An immortal being suddenly faced with the one thing he believed was pretty much impossible. It's an unraveling of his entire sense of reality and existence. But unfortunately for Godwin, his grim fate would not end with death. What you see in the beginning cutscene of the game is not the assassins killing Godwin. He's presumably already been killed in this image, but rather they are defiling his corpse, marking him with the curse of death. This wasn't just an assassination, it was an orchestrated ritual. This event would forever curse not only Godwin, but the entirety of the lands between, something I would only realize much later in the game. After the intro, you don't see Godwin for a long time, to the point where I almost forgot about him. But he was always there, the consequences of his death seeping up from the very soil of the earth. But this was out of the reach of my understanding, till I traveled through the dead cities of the Nox and into the giant coffin, which is the deep root depths. There I found what remained of Godwin, and I had no words. At first I couldn't even tell what the hell I was looking at, but then I started to recognize hair, then a set of eyes, then a face. I then noticed his arms look like they're pinned up and he is hanging down from the weight of his head. That's when I recalled the intro cutscene showing the Black Knife assassins holding Godwin up and carving the curse mark into his back. The connection was made in my brain, and I couldn't believe this was the same demigod. And then the finer details started to hit me. Why the hell does he have a fishtail? Is his body adapting to the water surrounding him, as if it's evolving or de-evolving? Or did the water come from him? Did he fall from the ocean above and into this tomb? His body is riddled with roots, similar to the corpses we see under the Erd Tree in different tombs throughout the game. But these are different. In the aforementioned example, it feels like the Erd Tree is feeding off of the corpse, almost like food. But in this case, it feels like Godwin's corpse is feeding off the tree's roots, like a parasite. They're infested with what looks like dead maggots, as if his decay is spreading through and corrupting the roots. Some of these roots even sprout wings from the maggot larvae, like those of flies. And then there are the eyes. They're growing out of the branches, scattered across his decrepit form. Each one of them seems to stare blankly, void of life, yet it still feels like they can see you and are intently watching you. The longer I stood there, the more questions bubbled up in my mind, leaving me with a sense of dread and wonder that I couldn't shake. The more I looked, the more I felt the weight of his tragedy. A being once revered and beloved, now reduced to this writhing, corrupted mass of death and decay. And another thing to note about this reveal is just how subversive it is. Miyazaki is no stranger to messing with the player in creative and interesting ways, and while previous iteration in Miyazaki's fun house of tomfuckery have gone something like this,
I truly am the king of the monkeys. Fuck. What the f- No! 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 What? What the f-
This time we get the inverse of this prank. When I first walked into this very large space comfortable enough to, I don't know, slug it out with a giant and horrifying corpse of a demigod, I fully expected this MF to spring into action and give me a good old slap across the chin. But instead I was met with an eerie stillness only a corpse can give you. I work with many corpses in my day job, and one thing that has never gone away is the uncanny stillness I feel from a dead body's gaze. Your brain knows for a fact a corpse is probably not going to move or look around, with some exceptions, but there's still something that tugs on your subconscious fear and makes you wary of being near this strange, uncanny form of a humanoid. This often doesn't translate well to games. Corpses are a dime a dozen in most games, and especially Souls games. I mean, they literally treat corpses like lootable wooden crates in the Souls series. So unless you're playing a horror game that reanimates corpses whenever it feels like it just to make you shit your pants, this eerie stillness simply doesn't exist in video games. But here it does. FromSoft has conditioned me to see a big-ass arena, a big-ass monster, and use my last 2 brain cells to conclude that he is going to get up. But instead, nothing. Only stillness and dread. So, what the hell even happened to Godwyn? Well, luckily for you, my dear viewer, during the making of this video, I've worked tirelessly day in and day out to finally become passably literate. So let me put these new reading comprehension skills to work. On that fateful night of the Black Knives, the assassins sent to apprehend Godwyn were not sent there to merely kill him. They were sent there to desecrate his body through ritual. When they carved the curse mark into Godwyn's flesh, they murdered his soul, but made it so that his body would live on, void of a soul. Although live on is probably a poor choice of words, as it would probably be more accurate to say Godwyn's body would be stuck in never-ending death. Death is usually the end of life, but in this case, it is the inverse life. It is entropy given the qualities of life, such as growth, persistence, and metabolism. This is honestly probably the coolest concept in the game I haven't really seen done elsewhere. The state of Godwyn's body is a corruption of the natural order of life and death, which produces a mindless parasite-like creature whose nature is to infect everything around it. I keep calling the thing Godwyn, but it really isn't anymore. It is his body's death taken form, spreading its disease. Remember earlier when I mentioned how Godwyn's corpse feels like it's feeding off of the Tree's roots? After learning the context behind his current state, it feels almost like the corpse is assimilating the roots of the tree by spreading its rot onto it. Kind of like when a finger becomes necrotic, you have to amputate it, lest you risk the rot spreading to the other living tissue. And after learning this, things I had seen across the lands between began to make more sense. Godwyn's presence lingers across the entire game through the spread of Deathroot. You can find this stuff all throughout the lands between. It affects animals, people, and spreads into large clumps of mass that I could only imagine smells like a miasma of death. Some of these clumps even grow eyes. Perhaps given enough time, another head of Godwyn's corpse would appear. We don't have to rely on our imagination of what that would look like. Under Stormveil Castle, you can find a giant corpse that has an uncanny resemblance to the already uncanny abomination that was Godwyn. This thing is creepy as hell. Take that stillness thing I was talking about before and crank it up another notch. First time I came here, I thought I was getting my ass set back to the bonfire. There's a ton of theories on how the corpse got here, like how it might have spread via Deathroot, or maybe someone transported it and dumped it down the cellar. But given the way the corpse is jutting out of the natural stone, it makes me think it has been burrowing its way from Godwyn's original corpse all the way to Stormveil. We can even find some of these surrogate corpses of Godwyn in the Land of Shadows underneath some catacombs. We always find these things underground and they seem to be growing or spreading. Zafe the Scholar made an excellent video where he discovered that just out of bounds of one of these corpses in the DLC, you can see its full arm buried in the earth, looking like the creature from the Black Lagoon. But they're just corpses, right? They can't kill us or anything, right? Well, tell that to poor Rogier over there. Bro got absolutely folded. Just because that thing chooses not to kill you when you reach it, doesn't mean it can't. And oh my god, is it bleeding? Are those teeth? Alright, yeah, I've had enough of this damn thing. It's honestly one of the best horror concepts in Souls games. I love the idea of death being corrupted. In Gothic horror, death is usually the end result of corruption. But to see that barrier broken and taken even further is simply awesome. It's not just the fear of death anymore, it's the consequences of death breaking its constraints. Something that should be final and absolute, refusing to end. Oh, wait a second. I guess this isn't that new of a concept. Damn it, Miyazaki, the mad lad has done it again. But seriously, I think this is the most horrifying use of this thematic motif Miyazaki loves to include. Sure, we've seen cursed undead wander aimlessly, consumed by hollowing depression, and we've seen kingdoms rot into literal ash because the natural order was tampered with. But that leans further into tragedy. Godwyn's corpse feels firmly planted in horror. Death, something we already fear, is characterized as something actively hostile. Every time I see Deathroot choking the land or some poor creature infested with it, except the crabs,
Neck yourself, crustacean curs!
I'm shown that death is no longer metaphysical. It's a monster in its own right. But I suppose calling death a monster is narrow-minded of me. After all, there are individuals in the lands between who don't see death as such, but rather they choose to serve death and live within it. Now admittedly, My gut reaction is to call these people absolute depraved lunatics, but I mean, who am I to issue a moral prescription to a group of individuals who are so dedicated to their job and duty that they openly disclose their freaking kinks in their full legal name? The first one you meet is the face of this movement, resident necrophiliac Fia the Deathbed Companion. You might remember her from the opening cinematic, being caught in the act. But all standards and just morals probably left all ye tarnished the moment you saw her in the round table hold, on a bed, asking you to hug her. You people make me sick.
Did you let her hug you?
Well, I had to do her quest line and get on the important lore and horror. It's not important anyways. While Fia puts up a kind and warm exterior, if you put your guard down around her, she can influence you to do something pretty awful. During one of your sessions of cuddle time, Fia, knowing you're in your most pathetic and malleable state, asks the Tarnished to deliver a dagger back to a man named D, Hunter of the Dead, who just so happens to be vehemently opposed to the whole necrophilia thing. Not being one to question their new goth GF, the Tarnished obliges Fia's request, and the next time you come to check on D, well, let's just say bro was no match for the overwhelming force of degeneracy Fia subjected him to when she forced him to read the comments under one of her Instagram posts. Fia isn't so innocent, and those little hugs she gives you, they're not free. Without warning, her hugs suck out your vigor, which I'm sure is a clever euphemism by the devs. I mean, it was one of the first Elden Ring memes, because most early game players didn't even notice this until they started wondering why they're suddenly folding faster than a United Healthcare CEO. Fia is like a succubus, taking the vigor of those she lies with to use in the resurrection of noblemen. So basically, a nymphomaniac, necrophilic necromancer. Nice. But who exactly is she trying to resurrect? Well, I forgot to add another adjective to that triple N. She's also a mermophile. Oh man, this girl needs Jesus, bro. Yeah, that's right. This whole time I haven't finished talking about Godwyn. She's trying to resurrect this fish boy by taking the essence of champions she seduces into laying with her. And we can even see that once a champion fully gives their soul to her, she can use them to fight for her, like we see in a later boss fight. The first 3 champions we fight are actually the spirits of other players who laid with Fia, which is both pathetic and sad, but kind of an awesome way of implementing asynchronous multiplayer. Wait a second. Is that Rogier? Man, I know you were desperate after your, incident, but come on, bro. She also commands this absolute unit, who also happens to be her adopted father. But honestly, incest is pretty commonplace in Elden Ring, so comparably, emotional incest is overshadowed by her other degenerate kinks. But putting the stupid jokes aside, I do think Fia and her followers add to the horror of death presented in Elden Ring. Death is almost elevated to a godlike status, with what is basically a cult worshipping it and trying to rebirth it and make it a part of the Elden Ring, the foundations of the world. It kind of reminds me of the cult of Silent Hill and their whole purpose of birthing a god. I found it very funny that Fia's ending features a lot of mist, but I mean, it basically looks like fog. It is also through Fia's quest that we learn that death, this horrible corrupting force which takes the shape of Godwyn's corpse, is actually being held back by a martyr of sorts. Lich Dragon Fortisax. This boss fight is awesome. Like I said in the previous video in this series, I'm going to be saying that a lot about Elden Ring. But I mean, come on. Look at this skybox. The body horror, the atmosphere, the drama. Just cinema. Pure cinema. After Fia lays with Godwyn, you can enter her dream, where we come face to face with the dragon who has been hopelessly attempting to remove the death curse from Godwyn's body. Lich Dragon Fortisax was a good friend to Godwyn in life, and after discovering the fate that befell his former friend, gave his life to fighting the death consuming Godwyn's corpse. As you might have guessed, this fight did not go in his favor, and he was consumed and corrupted by the overwhelming force of death. To me, not only is this story tragic, but it's also kind of terrifying to think the horrible and terrifying corruption of death we've seen all throughout the lands between and in the many corpses of Godwyn is just a fraction of what devastation this force could bring. It was being held back this whole time. And as we'll learn in the next video in this series, this is not the only horrifying existential threat to the lands between that is just barely being held back. Similar to Midir fighting and containing the abyss within himself, or Martyr Ligarius who sacrificed his life to contain what he believed to be a great evil. And of course, Artorias, the original martyr. These stories all mirror the tragedy of Lich Dragon Fortisax and his fight to free Godwyn from the terrible death incarnate. There's an undeniable beauty to the loyalty of Lich Dragon Fortisax and his hopeless attempt to fight the inevitable for what he believed was good. It's a timeless archetype, one we recognize in the real world all too well. People standing firm in the pursuit of good, even when confronted by forces far beyond their control, overwhelming and indifferent. To me, this beauty only heightens the tragedy of their often grim fate, something Gothic horror shows especially well through contrast, a contrast between light and dark. Gothic horror is a genre defined by its juxtapositions. And if you've watched my Fallout video, you know I love me some juxtapositions. Gothic horror is about the interplay of opposites, light and dark, good and evil, life and death, beauty and rot. Gothic horror contrasts the defilement of nature that is a reanimated corpse with the profound beauty of that creature's humanity and soul. Just think of the deep shadows in the classic Universal monster era of horror movies, which adapted famous Gothic horror stories. The movies took the thematic contrast of those stories and translated it into a fairly on-the-nose but awesome visual parallel. Elden Ring is no stranger to the use of contrast. In fact, I'd go as far to say that Elden Ring's use of contrast is the main aspect of its art direction that makes it great. Let's go over some examples. One of the most memorable moments in the game for me is found in the very first area of the game. Limgrave. Limgrave is a lush, sprawling countryside drenched in golden sunshine, with the Erd tree glowing oh so majestically in the distance. Now, the scale on display here is the very first act of contrast. The Erd tree looked so grand in scale that I thought there was no way in hell it wasn't just a backdrop. It makes you feel small and frames Limgrave in this almost fairy tale-like way. The contrast actually reminds me a lot of Kakariko Village and the Deku tree from Ocarina of Time. No surprise there, given how connected Elden Ring feels to the DNA of Ocarina, except, well, this is Elden Ring. So instead of little elf children and fairies, all we get is screaming crucified victims and Santa Claus peddling rusty knives. But this is not the contrast I wanted to focus on. Just east of this mostly tranquil landscape lies the literal incarnation of hell. Caelid, a Hieronymus Bosch painting. I pity the man who got Caelid's reveal spoiled for them, because discovering Caelid was one of the coolest moments in all of FromSoft's games. As you approach this hellscape, the sky transitions from a faded yellow to a blood-stained red. The ground begins to fester with these strange fungus-like growths. It truly feels like a wasteland. I'm going to be talking about Caelid in way more detail in the next video in this series, but what I want to highlight is just how drastic the contrast is between Limgrave and Caelid. Like, imagine you're a little 7-year-old kid playing Ocarina. You start in this cute little elf village. You finish the first dungeon, get the Ocarina from Saria, finally leave the village full of spirit and adventure. And then you step into literal hell and get swallowed by a giant demon dog thing. Wait a second. Doesn't something like that happen in Ocarina? Maybe I gotta make a video on Zelda one day. But back to Elden Ring. The stark contrast between these two starting regions makes Caelid feel even more oppressive and horrifying. And this is especially true if you were naive enough to think Miyazaki would get rid of chest traps with the removal of mimics. I remember the first time I got trapped by this damn thing. I struggled to survive the disgusting bug wardens you find in Tesla's Cobalt slave mine, just to barely make it out by the skin of my teeth. I then exited the cave in relief, only to find myself deep in the belly of this hellish wasteland, much deeper than I ever dared to go before. It was awesome. But Caelid isn't the only example in Elden Ring of this stark contrast between light and dark. Far from it. There's so many, in fact, I can't possibly go over every single one. So I'll leave you with one of my favorites. Leyndell, the royal capital. At first, the capital is this tranquil golden city, the very embodiment of divine splendor and grandeur. It is clearly past its prime and holds a somber melancholy, but its past prowess is undeniable. Yet beneath that surface lies a descent into madness. The discarded omens, literal dumpster babies, inhabit the sewers and prey on any who venture down into their depths. And even further beneath these forsaken sewers, an evil so vile it needed to be buried and locked away deep underground to prevent calamity. Elden Ring is constantly reminding you that this world used to be glorious, golden even, but now it's rotting from the inside out. The Erdtree may still glow, but everything beneath it is festering and poses an existential threat to the existence of everyone in the lands between. There's so much masterful use of contrast in Elden Ring, even the enemy designs use it well. Many of the creatures are grotesque, yet oddly beautiful, like someone took a Victorian painting and dragged it through a Miyazaki original poison swamp of nightmares and despair. I could legitimately see most of these enemy designs showing up in medieval depictions of hell, but I talked plenty about the creature designs in the previous video in this series, so go watch that one if you haven't. Earlier, when talking about the consequences of Godwyn's death, I touched on how Lich Dragon Fortisax's fruitless battle against the death inside Godwyn's body was both beautiful and dark. The romantic notion of giving your life to your dearest friend, that brotherly love. Even when there's no winning the fight, we give it all for each other. Love, going face to face with death incarnate. And Gothic horror actually finds its origins in the Romantic era of literature, where the beauty of nature and humanity were common themes. Gothicism can be considered a subgenre of sorts, or evolution of Romanticism, where they tackled a lot of the same themes: human emotion, the sublime, subjective feeling, and consciousness. Gothic horror is the marriage of beauty and darkness, which results in a palpable tragedy. A tragedy that Elden Ring players are all too familiar with.
All vessels are destined to one day break. But the great Alexander lived as a warrior to his last.
What? Yo, wait, what do you mean? We were just fucking around.
Characters in Gothic horror often grapple with isolation, grief, and guilt, making their emotional journeys as important to the story as the horror. The protagonists are often flawed, driven by obsession, ambition, or a forbidden desire for knowledge. This ambition often leads them to ruin, as they uncover truths they were never meant to know. Some of them losing their purpose, some dying prematurely or being cursed, and others dying from their ambitions. It's honestly kind of a meme how many character storylines end in their death or far worse. At its core, Gothic horror is an exploration of the human condition. It asks us to confront the darkness in the world and within ourselves, to consider what lies beyond the veil of mortality, and to grapple with the consequences of our deepest, darkest emotions, like rage.
Curse you, Baal! I hereby vow you will rue this day!
Egon. Oh, Egon. A fan favorite for good reason. A hobo literally too angry to die, Egon is rage incarnate. Revenge taken flesh. Now, we can't talk about Egon without talking about the heavy influence of Moby Dick on Egon's story. Bro is literally Ahab. Moby Dick is awesome. Straight up one of the greatest revenge stories ever told. To the uninitiated, it might seem like just a boring story about hunting a whale, and I mean sure, that is the plot, but it's also about obsession, humanity's struggle to conquer and understand forces beyond their nature, and how rage and revenge can drive you to absolute madness. The story's influence across media is insane. It's everywhere, even in places you wouldn't expect. What makes Moby Dick's influence so interesting is that it's not just about the whale, it's about how the characters project their feelings, insecurities, and beliefs onto the beast. This idea of an unstoppable force, the thing you just have to conquer, despite your fragility, despite your insignificance, is just timeless and keeps popping up in stories across genres, just like that of old Egon. When we first meet Egon, we find him in his lowest moment.
My arms, my legs, each lies a bloody ruin.
And it's not long before he gives us a piece of his mind.
Bale! Vile Bale! Oh, terror incarnate! There is life in me yet! I will soon feast upon your heart! Mark my words! You too shall know fear!
As I've mentioned in a previous video, Elden Ring does such a good job at building up tension and suspense for bosses, and Bale is no different. We can piece together the hell Bale put Egon through by just how broken his body is, but we also hear from multiple NPCs about the dreadful beast living on the Jagged Peak, which you can see at multiple points of the DLC. This jagged peak is daunting to look at with its epic scale, and even more daunting to climb. During my ascent, I came across two drakes in the midst of a fierce battle. Being the absolute Chad that I am, I made quick work of these two baby bitch burgers, no sweat. I totally did not hide in a bush till they killed each other. Hey, don't judge me, I couldn't find any more skadoosh fragments. But at least someone was impressed with my performance, as, in the distance, I heard a familiar voice.
What a sight! A warrior true, if ever one there was. Break warrior!
This whole part had me grinning cheek to cheek. It's so endearing how Egon was quiet the entire battle, watching on with great patience, only to become a complete bro and celebrate your victory like you were his own brother. It adds humanity to his character and recontextualizes his quest for revenge. Unlike many other characters who are seeped in their rage, with no sign of life beyond that, Egon is different. Under all of his rage, there's still an endearing person inside. Maybe if he wasn't on his quest, he'd be another Solaire or Sigurd. But alas, that's only in my imagination, because he does indeed have his quest, and he recruits your assistance to fulfill it.
Egon. Piteous Egon. Do you not remember? Conjure your past, how once you were, when fear was yet foreign to you. Drake Warrior, dear friend, grant me this one wish. Take this finger, my finger, scale the jagged peak, face Bale the Dread, and when you do, summon me. Summon my soul. My limbs are limbs no more. My heart is twice over filled with fear. But a Drake warrior I remain, and my soul yet lies on the mountain.
Egon cutting off his finger so we can summon him to kill Bale is metal as shit. But nothing would prepare me for how metal this man's entrance would be once I summoned him.
Curse you, Bale! I hereby vow you will rue this day. Behold, a true Drake warrior, And I, Egon, your fears made flesh. Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, but I will riddle with holes your rotten hide with a hail of harpoons, with every last drop of my being. Yeah!
Now, I know what you're thinking.
Holy shit, that was awesome.
Unless you're a complete buzzkill, and instead we're objecting to the idea that anything this epic and badass could not possibly be horror. Well, I don't think it takes a literary degree to see how similar this story is to Moby Dick. And Moby Dick itself, I would argue, is Gothic horror. Now, this is a long-standing debate on the arbitrary question of whether Moby Dick was a Gothic or dark romantic novel. In the interest of not getting the attention of snobby English literature scholars, I have dealt with them too much for one lifetime, I would rather focus on the soul of Moby Dick's story, and why, as a horror fanatic, I love it. Moby Dick may not have the Scooby-Doo characteristics of Gothic horror, but at its heart, it embodies everything Gothic horror stands for. It's a tale of obsession, isolation, and humanity's terrifying insignificance in the face of the unknowable. Ahab's relentless pursuit of the white whale isn't simply a revenge story. It's a descent into madness. A descent into the abyss in the most literal sense. And we don't need to look far into horror media to see its influence. A lot of classic horror movies kind of become Moby Dick in a way. Take The Thing, with MacReady cussing out the Thing in sheer contempt.
Yeah, fuck you too!
Or Alien, where Ripley develops a personal rage towards the xenomorphs. And I mean, obviously, Jaws. I think that goes without saying. All entities which, like animals, have no malice besides their predatory instincts. These human characters are angry over forces of nature that we personify as personally wrathful or insidious. The creatures serve as a mirror that reveals how dirty we truly are. Bale, like the whale, is consumed by untempered rage, unwilling to be subjugated. Fighting fire with fire, Egon has felt fear from Bale's wrath, and he wants Bale to feel that same fear. So much so that he strips himself of his flesh, so that his heart can no longer feel fear, and he gives you his soul to use in battle. This ultimately leads to his death.
Bale the Dread! You shall haunt me no longer!
Ahab is a man in the Old Testament of the Bible who was a corrupt king that led the Israelites to idolatry. Ahab in Moby Dick is obsessed with the whale, which represents his lust for revenge and hatred. His hatred and his anger is his idol, his god, and he serves his false god well. He claims to not submit to a higher power, yet falls victim to a false power all the same. He wants to dominate nature, yet is dominated by his own fallen nature. Sounds a lot like Egon's desire to make Bale fear. When Egon fights Bale, he's fighting a reflection of his own rage. After consuming Bale's heart, you can choose one of two incantations. Both have something interesting to say about this consumption you've just partaken in. Even after being consumed, the throbbing heart of Bale continues to resist its subjugation, never weakening. One day, the fire within will consume the very body and soul of its communion devourer. One day, Bale will return. The same hatred we used to devour Bale will be the same hatred that consumes us. It is probably a good thing Egon will not live to see this day. It is a mercy to be able to excuse yourself from the eternal dance of light and dark that takes place in our hearts. And on that note, we have reached the end of today's long and dark road. But hey man, you forgot to mention this, and this, and this. Right you are, sir or madam. This video is actually part 2 in a series. The first was solely focused on the body horror of Elden Ring, and my next video will be on the ever-beloved cosmic horror of Elden Ring. That video will be the last in the series, so please leave a comment about what you want me to talk about in that video, and I'll do my best to include it if I haven't already touched on it. So, until next time, dear viewers, I will see you in your dreams.